My name is Dr. HANS. In 2000, I received my MD, became an infectious diseases and internal medicine doc. In 2017, I became a rare disease advocate when my son was diagnosed with SYNGAP1. And in 2021, I joined industry to work on rare diseases as much as possible. And while usually I would smile and say I really enjoy talking about rare diseases, today's topic is a bit somber. I'm going to talk about how the saddest outcomes can have lessons. So it was about 3.5 weeks ago that Sarepta needed to report that they had a death within their Elevidys program. And this is a gene therapy for Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. And what I understand from, the sources, a 16-year-old who had received Elevidys a few months earlier had acute liver failure. Part of that was that there was also a recent cytomegalovirus infection, and you see that here, and could have been a contributing factor. They shared this with the community. Also, their investors and, the fiduciary responsibility and the transparency that is expected. They shared it with the regulatory bodies and the EU for the, balance of concern for a conservative approach, recommended that the trials in the European Union be paused. This despite the data monitoring committee reviewing the case and the protocol discussing the risk benefit and saying, those trials could continue without modification. But again, all things considered, a pause is the conservative approach. I have to admit, as a rare disease advocate, I can't imagine a parent and a patient, preparing for participation in that trial, looking forward to it, the hope that builds up, and then having to hit the pause button. So, I've paid attention to the Duchenne's community since my son's diagnosis. And part of that was because, in that desperation of figuring out something quickly, I landed on Adalurin, a medication or an investigational drug to do nonsense read-through. And my son has a nonsense variant in SYNGAP. So, it was the Duchenne community that had, maybe 8 to 10 years experience with the medication, clearly safe, controversial efficacy. And, it motivated me to reach out to PTC Therapeutics and, lobby for expanded access along with my son's doctors. More recently, just even the past couple of years, keeping track of the Duchenne community, it's been a complete roller coaster. What immediately comes to mind is the Cure Rare program. The two brothers, one severely affected by Duchenne, the other, motivated to take on getting a treatment for his brother. And a week or so after the AAV gene treatment with a CRISPR-Cas9 payload, the affected brother passed away. Then there's also the Pfizer program of AAV gene therapy, where a non-ambulatory boy passed away also about a week after his treatment. And then there was a sudden death, I believe, a few months after receiving treatment. And there are, lessons learned out of these tragedies. That's the physician talking, that's the drug development teammate talking. And, with the Cure Rare, there was the really deep case report published in the New England Journal, which allowed, the community to take a look at what happened, talk about it, and, a sort of complete transparency. For Pfizer, they went to the community and had a webinar explaining the AAV gene therapy, what they had done differently following the non-ambulatory boys passing, and that's available through a video recording, and you can hear the changes that they made: hospitalization for a week, pediatric cardiology involvement, laboratory testing, etc. So it's really important that everyone involved share a close review of the case, so that the community, even beyond that treatment, can take away lessons from it. So what we know is, this 16-year-old boy or young man, after an AAV gene therapy and some component of cytomegalovirus infection, had acute liver failure. And hopefully there will be further details that come out of that. But, being a rare disease advocate, being an infectious disease doctor, I am going to share my 2 cents. You cannot just, take it as a recommendation to you. You should talk to your doctor about it. Some of the details absolutely still need to come out. But, what I think of is, AAV is naturally occurring family of viruses that are relatively benign by themselves. Don't worry. Clearly, after COVID and all the sheltering and all the kids staying inside and those viruses sort of waiting for the kids to come back out to play, the kids bumped into multiple viruses at the same time. And AAV2, here you see a report with co-infection, right? So multiple viruses, whether EBV or HHV6, enterovirus. Also here in a second report, in terms of there also being a genetic predisposition to liver failure, and the need for even a transplant for liver failure related to AAV. That is as bad as it gets in the natural state. Its use in gene therapy as a pharmaceutical, we know that high doses are worrisome. And, that line in the sand is right around 1 × 10⁻14 vector genomes per kilogram. And above that, there have been deaths, unfortunately, observed in the X-linked myotubular myopathy program of Astellas, the previous ones in the Duchenne community that I mentioned. And we know that the risks increase above that level. And the discussion includes an awareness that, this treatment above that level has its concerns. And the risk benefit is something that the patient is informed of when they consent to undergo the treatment. But when used correctly and safely, we've got amazing, success stories like Zolgensma, right? An AAV gene therapy for the spinal muscle atrophy kids. There's also Kability, and the Sarepta AAV gene therapy, Elevidys, from 2023 is pretty memorable because of, Peter Marks sort of going against the advisory committee, laying out a 7-page memo explaining why he wanted it approved under accelerated approval in 4 and 5-year-old. And I think that's admirable. The people that criticized him for it didn't seem to pick on something within the memo, and say, look, I disagree with his reading of the North Star outcome. I disagree with his, comments about the CK elevation improving, ... It was just, dark day at the FDA. How can he do this sort of criticisms, which to me are a bit hollow if they're not specific. So now, with the notice going out and the consequences, you say to yourself, what comes next? And like I, pointed out, the case report from Cure Rare, I think, illustrates what should be done under these circumstances. A clear-cut, detailed, peer-reviewed deep dive for a lesson learned in this circumstance. Even without that case report, not being in the room with the DMC, it's my 20 years as an infectious disease doc that tell me the CMV played a part, and potentially a quite significant one at that. Thinking back to, my own career, there's half a dozen cases of CMV that readily come to mind, between CMV retinitis, sort of eye reactivation and inflammation, CMV colitis, hepatitis, using valganciclovir, ganciclovir, cidofovir, etc., to bring it under control. And like the other herpes viruses, the CMV could have been an original infection where it could have been the 16-year-old's first experience, and those can be worse than reactivation. The idea that, the first time around your immune system hasn't seen it before, and in the setting of a gene therapy and likely steroids being on board, that's part of the package insert, the experience of an AAV gene therapy usually, CMV can get beyond the immune system's control. For reactivation, you've had an infection as a kiddo and you spent the day home from school and, bounced back pretty quickly. Viruses like CMV can reactivate. So maybe, you've undergone a kidney transplant and you're on all those immune suppressants and it comes out. It happens. Reactivation in the setting of profound HIV infection, CD4 count less than 100, and next thing you know, CMV is breaking out. That is easy to envision as another scenario where CMV reactivated and caused liver injury. We do need that case report for the community to really get the deepest degree of lessons learned from this. If it was a primary infection, well, clearly we have the awareness now, right? There can be monitoring simply from monitoring for signs and symptoms of infection, fevers, chills, night sweats, the CBC having atypical lymphocytes, other laboratory monitoring. And if it's reactivation, first of all, you can check to see if the person has a previous antibody response, an IgG to CMV. Okay, now I know they've seen it. Now we're going to keep track. And there's laboratory monitoring that happens for that. There's also the idea that you can be preventative. In my practice, I saw patients before an organ transplant. We would call this a pre-transplant evaluation. And that may be, an option for those undergoing AAV gene therapy, where they're brought in. You take a look at their serologies, you see if they're CMV experienced or not, if it's latent within them. You double check their vaccines, make sure that they're hepatitis A protected. God forbid they bump into that during the experience after a gene therapy. Make sure they're hepatitis B protected, etc. And sort of get them in the best condition you can for that upcoming gene therapy. And this is, essentially my message for, a Duchenne's family, considering Elevidys. Talk to your doctor, get the patient in the best condition possible. Do the labs that you need to see whether or not they have CMV or any other infection that the doctor wants to know about. Talk it through with them. And make sure that you don't feel alone in the decision-making. It's very appropriate to say to the doctor, what would you do in my shoes? It's at times unfair to leave it all to the patient. You've got 4 years of medical school, residency, fellowship, clinical experience. And of course, it's up to the patient, but I was always willing to say, if I were in your shoes, here what I would do, and here's why. I think that's a better version of shared decision-making. And, I like the quote from Winston Churchill when he said, if you're going through hell, keep going. And it may be a motto for the greater rare disease community, but I think particularly so for the Duchenne's community at this time. So hang in there, talk to your doctors, and try to find your optimism soon. All right. Thank you.